There is a phrase in the maritime world that the captain is God upon his ship. While that was arguably true on the high seas, when it came to navigating the dangerous shoals and hidden reefs around a port, captains were often mere passengers, as they handed over control of their vessels to local experts, the pilots. Pilots were hugely respected and highly skilled members of the maritime community. Without them, putting into port could be a hugely dangerous exercise. But in an age of empires, racism, and slavery, what happened when those pilots weren't white? Tonight, Andrew Lyter makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut to talk about his fascinating research into the black pilots who were plying their trade in North America and the Caribbean during the Napoleonic Wars. We talk about these men's origin stories, the way that they were treated by their white contemporaries, and how their positions of prominence in the Atlantic maritime community might have left ripples in the ongoing battle for civil rights. This is the Black Pilots of the Americas, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your part-time host and full-time quartermaster, Liam Telfer. As always, while the training wheels are still on, I've got the leader of our show, the captain of our ship, the cracker of the whip, Dr. Zach White, in the room with me today for a cracking episode. And just before Zach grasps the microphone off me, I want to say that this episode is really, really good. I know you guys are going to love it because it's one of those ones that really gives light on underrepresented groups, and it's what this show is all about. Wouldn't you agree, Zach?
It is. I'm looking forward to the point at which we can take the stabilizers off of your bike. At the moment, I think that's very much more sort of your daughter's sphere rather than yours. I think that time is rapidly approaching. But yeah, this is part of the kind of the joy of revitalizing this show, in that we've been able to do so much more, and also it's enabled us to kind of build that extra capacity where we don't have to constantly be a slave to the stories that people know about, and therefore they know they want to hear. And instead we can start to bring forward a lot of these kind of more, I mean, peripheral kind of sounds disparaging, but it's not meant in a disparaging way. It's just kind of stories that we don't necessarily know about that are really interesting and just don't get that same level of coverage because everybody's talking about Austerlitz for the 3,457th time this week, kind of thing. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And as Zach alluded to in what I like to call the sexy intro, we have a very special guest with us today, talking about a subject that I know he's passionate about. We've got Andrew J. Lyter. Andrew is the executive director and curator for the Lewes Historical Society in Lewes, Delaware, USA. I hope I'm saying that right. I've probably murdered it. The people of Delaware are, lighting the torches and grabbing the pitchforks as we speak.
Yeah, but I'm not being funny, but like, what the people of Delaware are going to do? Throw all of our tea into a harbor again? Like, you've tried that before. You've risen in revolt. You were clearly deeply ungrateful for the benevolence that very obviously was British rule, because that's how the British Empire operated over the 18th and 19th century. Like, everything was absolutely fine. So you've thrown off those shackles. So if we mispronounce a word here or there, honestly, what is there left for you to do? Like, write an angry letter? That's what we Brits specialize in. So
and just to go back to our fabulous guest intro, thanks for that, Zach. He holds an MA in naval history from our very own University of Portsmouth. So he's obviously seen the light at some point or other. He specializes in maritime identities of the revolutionary Atlantic, focusing on the history of sailors circa 1770 to 1815. Yeah, welcome, Andrew. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
I would also like to make sure that we plug Andrew's forthcoming book, which I've got written in front of me. As always, rapidly prepared on this show. His forthcoming book, Going Among English Sailors, the American Tars aboard HMS Belvedere, 1809 to 1814. And you can look forward to that being released in early November 2024. And as always, we will add any press to that in the show notes.
Appreciate it.
So, no, our pleasure, our pleasure. I'm quite happy to jump in with the first question if you're all right with that, Andrew.
Fantastic.
So, set the scene for us. Where was the USA at in its long journey to abolition in 1813? And why was Britain so subversive an influence?
Of course. So you see, honestly, after the American Revolution, you'll see small acts on the side of the American government towards moving towards abolition, but not really fully committing. In 1807, the importation of enslaved people became illegal. This was sort of an olive branch that President Jefferson had created. Came into effect January 1st, 1808, but it did not address the domestic slave trade. And there was still, illegal importation of enslaved people throughout the entire nation at this point. As you're both aware, your fine monarchy also passed the bill and act for an abolition of slave trade in 1807, prohibiting the slave trade in the British Empire. But you still saw this throughout the colonial holdings, which ultimately impacted America's trajectory as well. It would be another. 1865 really is when you finally saw the emancipation of enslaved people, the former Confederate states. So we're, I guess, making small efforts at the time that this chapter is focused, but enslaved population was on the rise, and Delaware, which I largely focus on through this chapter, had a massive enslaved population at this point and was a part of the South.
So, apologies, a lot of these questions are going to come from a position of extreme interest, but also extreme ignorance.
Sure
Why
thing.
the disparity in the population? Because one of the few things that I do know about slavery
Mm,
within the US system is that there is a much bigger concentration to the south of enslaved people than there is
sure.
to the north. And the immediate thought of that is, well, climate, a lot of this enslaved population is being used to grow sugar and tobacco, and
Yep.
climatically that's where you're going to grow those types of
Sure.
crops. But why is there then not an exploitation of an enslaved population to the same degree further north, doing menial labor of a different kind, whether it's, I don't know, dock work or whatever it
Sure.
might be? Why do we not see the spread in quite the same way?
That's fair. Yeah, so you'll still see it to an extent, but I'd largely base this upon sort of how this country was founded and the various morals and sort of platforms that independent states sort of set themselves on. Like, of course, an enslaved population existed up and down the eastern seaboard, but the South's entire economy revolved around this. There was no every individual that lived in the South, their entire wealth, their entire economy was based on enslaving humans. That's just a raw fact that the South will probably rise again and come at me for, but there's no disputing it. Delaware's economy, it was largely agrarian mixed with maritime pursuits. So you have Lewis, Delaware sits at the mouth of the Delaware Bay in the Atlantic, less than 100 miles from Philadelphia. So you have a large agrarian population, a lot of yeoman farmers, but these guys also owned vessels. Farther south you go, that same economy was driven by agriculture, by tobacco, cotton, things of that ilk that required a large labor force to really harvest and enter enslaved folks, unfortunately.
Staying absolutely on this topic, because I really want to get a decent sense of how not necessarily the system operates, but the realities for enslaved
Mm,
African Americans, if African American isn't the wrong term at this point. I'm not
works.
quite sure
Sure.
where the point at which that would be an appropriate
That's a
term
good,
comes
that's
in.
a good question.
But I guess the next obvious thing to discuss is opportunities for escape. So
Sure.
I'm more familiar with the British system, whereby there is um, the term that they would use is a marine community on a
Mm,
number of these islands where escaped slaves manage to escape into the interior of these islands. It's predominantly the coasts or the coastal regions that are more cultivated, partly because of easy access to ports for export markets.
certainly.
Um, and so the interior tends to be less heavily policed. And so for some slaves who are actually able to escape, one of the options is to escape, or the predominant option actually is to escape into the interior of the island. Now,
Mm,
America, big place.
hmm.
There's the least kind of enlightened comment that you'll hear on this podcast this week. America is a big place.
Facts.
So on the surface of things, you might therefore assume, okay, so there's a place to escape into. But of course, if you're on the coast in a big place, and these states are huge, um, that that isn't necessarily the case. And the only other thing that I vaguely think I know about American slavery is the idea that there is a kind of like a trail that develops, I suspect, a bit later
Mm,
for enslaved individuals to try and escape north to Canada, whereby they're then free from any kind of prospect of being recaptured by their American owners. And so, therefore, they can actually acquire freedom.
certainly.
Talk us through that escape process and
Sure.
those realities.
So what we in our era we're looking at, I mean, you have more options for mobility, more opportunities for escape on the coast. I mean, you'll see, pick any port community, you see opportunities regularly sailing in and out of your home port on a daily basis. I can't recall the author. He calls it they're winged angels. I forget the term, but swift winged angels. These vessels were able to transport enslaved people to a whole new world, a whole new opportunity, completely change their entire trajectory. We see during the American Revolution, with Lord Dunmore's proclamation in November of 1775, he recognized sort of how they could mobilize the enslaved population to his own end. But with this, you have this mass exodus of, I think it was over 3,000 enslaved families flocking to the British for protection. And these folks were obviously taken up to New York, and then by 1783, resettled up in Nova Scotia and elsewhere. But the British had this reputation, strangely enough, I mean, for being sort of this beacon of hope and freedom during the Revolution and the War of 1812. So it's kind of contrary to what most Americans would like to think, but
I find it hugely ironic, not just because of the kind of turning on its head of
mm,
what is seen as sort of one of those founding principles of
sure.
America, but also just the hypocrisy on the British
Oh,
side. Oh, look at us, aren't we wonderful? But don't look over at the Caribbean, where we are absolutely not prepared to consider emancipation of our enslaved populations. All we're doing is just not permitting you to continue to trade in human beings, because we are going to sit on our high horse and pedal that.
it's I mean, it's one of those where I don't think there was a higher level of morality. I think there was a more acute recognition of the opportunity that a population presented. I mean, you see Andrew Jackson in the South promising freedom to enslaved folks that assisted him and rallied to his banner at New Orleans and whatnot. He didn't do a thing. He was king of the dirtbags. We should probably edit that out. But I mean, he
We are not a fan of Andrew Jackson on this
uh,
show, to the point where he appeared in a discussion of the worst politicians of the
good.
Napoleonic era.
We're on the
Uh,
same page. That's excellent.
absolutely. I will take that as vindication that I was right. Um,
But yeah, I think it really is just recognizing the opportunity and how you can how you can leverage a population against your enemy. And the enslaved population was not dumb. I mean, these individuals fully recognized the opportunity that service in the British Navy or an American merchant vessel, the American Navy, they were opportunistic as well. And once these avenues of freedom no longer sort of aligned with their hopes, they would look elsewhere. So,
On the subject of sort of questions that might make American listeners angry,
mm,
I I will freely acknowledge that Twitter is a cesspool, right? But one of the things that I have seen crop up in the past and just keep well away from because I can see just how much of a unique kind of latrine pit it is this discussion about whether or not the American Civil War was about slavery.
uh,
Now, of course, if I express an opinion on this, then lots of American listeners will go, "What do you know? You're a Brit." Um, well, I can pick up a history book, but my sense is very strongly no. It's absolutely about slavery.
I,
Um,
I, I like to call it the War of the Slaveholders' Rebellion, is what we like to call it. That's all it is. And if you disagree, you're likely a bigot. Um, that's unfortunately how it works. States' rights were not I mean, it's a factor, but there was one dominant desire, and it's to keep your enslaved population, to fuel your economy, and simple as that. So,
so I promised that I wouldn't continue to rabbit hole. Liam is looking at me. He's giving me what I call the dog stare, which is like when a dog is trying to intimidate somebody to like go away from the area that it's guarding. That's what I'm getting right now for our listeners who obviously don't have the benefits of the video from this.
sure.
But you're gonna have to start growling at me, quite frankly, mate. Because I do just want to kind of tap into how you guys remember this because obviously we've had our own
Mm,
kind of conversations in the UK about our imperial legacy and the
of course.
legacy of the slave trade. Um, it for the US, I feel like there's another additional layer because such a significant proportion of the heritage of the American people is built upon the slave trade. So,
Oh,
how do the conversations kind of work in the US about this? And how are
sure.
you guys trying to resolve that?
Um, I mean, we're in 2024. I think this nation's as split as it was during the eve of the Civil War. Sort of politically over where we're headed and how we need to work together and not go in that direction. I think, thankfully, in the world that I work in and sort of my community, there's a new recognition. I mean, the favorite cop out is like, well, my ancestor was in the shipping industry, but they did not import any enslaved people, but they did go down to the Caribbean and get rum and sugar and bring it back to New England. I mean, they're a part of the problem, right? I mean, whether it's recognized or not, they're a part of that triangular trade. They're a part of the slave trade, and folks are stepping up and recognizing that across the board. I mean, you have northern states that would plead innocent, but had an active role, very active role in this. So I think that level of recognition across the board, that's a great step. But my God, there's a lot of work that needs to be done still. Um, that's the best I could probably sum that up.
I mean, it's powerful stuff. I kind of want to go back. And to be fair, the dog stare comes from the fact that Zach's taken all the rabbit holes.
Of
Um,
course, not a worry.
I kind of want to go back to that revolutionary period and look at, you've got this. I don't suppose it's a mass exodus, but I mean, maybe you can answer that. Again, this is coming from a place of massive interest and not
Mm,
much knowledge for me
right.
of slaves or enslaved people heading towards the British for the obvious reasons. I can't imagine that they all get there, and some would settle on the way, some would find other opportunities. What are the sort of numbers like to start with? That are leaving and being a slave, and also what are their sort of routes look like? What do they do on the way, and how many of them actually just find employment, or is that a thing? Do they start businesses? Do they
Sure.
find trades?
Yeah, that's so let's I guess we could start with the revolution at least. So with Dunmore's proclamation, this was November 7th of 1775. He's this colonial, governor of Virginia. He offers this proclamation up that pretty much come join the British and we'll free you. We'll take you to freedom. It was ideally targeted at men that could serve in the military forces of Great Britain, but you have women and children that are just flocking to his banner, responding to this proclamation. And it really, I mean, it was more than his fleet, more than they could really handle. So now you have all these women and children on top of this enslaved population that are desperately trying to just flee while you're trying to wage a war. So this entire group, I mean, over the course of the revolution, it was 3,000 individuals that were like to identify as refugees, right? So they're loyalists. I prefer the term refugee because I am an Anglophile at heart, and that's another reason I'll be, torn down by my countrymen. But these folks were repatriated from New York to Nova Scotia on various vessels. So one individual that I focus on in this chapter, Edward Godfrey, he was one of these enslaved people. So 12 years old, he was in Virginia, working on the plantation of Matthew Godfrey, along with the rest of his family, and they all responded to Dunmore's proclamation. And ultimately, he made his way up to New York, and from New York, he went to Nova Scotia, and he started a new life there. He was now a free man of color. He got to Nova Scotia in late summer of 1783 and completely I guess kind of started anew, and he became a ship's pilot. So this is probably an anomaly. It's not that all great success stories, but 30 plus years later, you have yet another war. He's now living up in Canada, and you have vessels in need of skilled pilots. And this man knew the eastern coast of this country and was able to leverage that knowledge for employment aboard a British vessel. And I like to think for an opportunity for a level of retribution against his former enslavers nation. But that fellow Matthew Godfrey, his former master, he claimed the loss at the end of the Revolution of 35 enslaved people that all fled to Lord Dunmore. So it was massive population. If you want to jump ahead to the War of 1812, you have a similar sort of opportunity that was made available to these folks. Earl Bathurst had his proclamation in 1813 that these naval commanders are now offering up, like, come join us. We'll give you freedom, and individual slaves that could help with the operations. We'll get you to safety and provide freedom for you. And this is where you see, I mean, the core of like colonial Marines, the West Indian Regiment, resettling these folks up in Nova Scotia. And in some rare cases, you do have men joining as ship's pilots, as sailors on the crew, various things of that nature. But over the course of the War of 1812, following the Treaty of Ghent, America went after Britain for something to the tune of $30 million in today's currency for sort of reimbursement of their, and no one can see my air quotes, but property. They claimed that much money. So this is a mass exodus. In Delaware, you only see two enslaved people that Delawareans went after for reimbursement, and that's two pilots that we'll talk about later that served within the British Navy on the Delaware Bay.
We are just about to go there right now, funnily enough. But I'm curious about why only two individuals. Is that a reflection of a smaller enslaved population?
Not necessarily. I don't know how. From what I've found, the British squadron on the Delaware Bay was not as active or as visible as that on the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake, yes, has a much larger enslaved population. You have far more tributaries and creeks and rivers that all form into this bay. I think much wider networks of communication amongst enslaved populations. In Delaware, I mean, the British Navy really didn't go far up the Delaware River. To me, it sort of was a side project and an appendage of the Chesapeake blockade. And at its high water mark, there were 5 vessels on the Delaware Bay. So it really was not that same draw. I also think there were more enslaved folks that fled to the British Navy. I've gone through all the muster books. I haven't found them yet, but maybe it was just two of the more dominant masters that went after sort of reimbursement. I don't know, unfortunately.
I mean, that is the joy of the research process, right? In time,
No,
you
of
find more
course.
info and it sheds light on these things.
Exactly.
So, with reference to the focus of what was meant to be today's episode, he says, with a glance at the stopwatch, realizing that we are half an hour in almost. We haven't really talked about the nub of your research here.
Sure.
Welcome to the Rabbit Hole podcast. Um, you've looked within your research at, and I'm going to ruin the pronunciation of this ship,
I do as well.
HMS Poictiers.
I think that's probably how the French would pronounce it. I say Poitiers is what I've heard as well. I mean, but yeah, correct.
That ship.
Yes.
Notice how we didn't call it boat because we are professional on this show.
I
So you've looked at that ship as a case study. I just wonder, you've given us some hints towards this already, but just talk us through some of the background on the black pilots they took on, and why did you choose to focus on this ship particularly?
Sure. So I'll start with this ship. This HMS Poictiers. I mean, she was a 74 gun ship of the line. Captain Beresford, from 1813 onward, he was the commodore of the squadron that blockaded the Delaware Bay. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole and plug my community, but like every proud American port town, we resisted a British bombardment in 1813. So it's this story that is still told to. I mean, there's horrible children's books about it, how they resisted the British and only a chicken and a pig were killed. And we have a home in town that has a cannonball lodge in its foundation. It's adjacent to the fort that resisted this British attack. My approach towards digging into this research was trying to shine light on the British perspective. I mean, these are humans. These are not the evil enemy. Let's sort of flesh this out a bit more and try to tell a more complete story of the bombardment of Lewis. So this vessel, she oversaw the bombardment and the lion's share of the blockade of the Delaware Bay. So why did I choose this one to flesh out? It's the biggest vessel. It was the Commodore ship. Um, it's the greatest sort of number of sailors, as you're both aware, on that crew. So greatest opportunity for new research.
Before we talk about the second part of that, though, just because I know our listeners will be curious, that Beresford, it's the brother of William Carr Beresford for regular listeners who perhaps know the Portuguese and Wellingtonian side of this. So yes, there is a family connection that you heard there, folks. But with reference to the I suppose the interview, the point why we're here. Where have my questions gone? Right, we'll make another note of the time. 27. Sorry.
Not a worry.
Welcome to the unprofessional podcast that is the Napoleonic Wars pod. But yeah, just to kind of dig into the lives of these two black pilots, tell us a little bit more
Sure.
about their background.
Yep. So, I mean, what I came at, I'll give you this background actually. So, Lewis was a community, adjacent community called Pilot Town. Historically, since the 17th century, was the home of ships' pilots for the Delaware River and Bay. So, this entire relationship, akin to what you'll see in Great Britain, I mean, based out of Trinity House and whatnot, is these pilots will board the vessel, take over the vessel, navigate it through local waterways. So, you have a large native population, later a large enslaved population, white population, you name it, individuals residing in the community that know the intricacies of these local waterways better than absolutely anyone. They've fished on them their entire life. They've navigated vessels 88 miles up the Delaware River, then back down the Atlantic. So they know this better than anyone. Two individuals that I really looked at were Jeremiah Primrose and Peter Wood. They pop up on the muster book of the Poictiers as volunteers, actually from New Jersey, which is wrong. It's it's the other side of the Delaware River, but I'm intrigued by American volunteers that were fleeing to the British. So these guys really jumped out at me, and that started a rabbit hole that you both know all too well. Um, so we started digging into this, but both of these individuals were living in what was known as Miss Pillion Hundred. This would have been a very agricultural region right adjacent to the Delaware River, and would have been the largest plantation in this part of Delaware. A 655-acre farm where this fellow, their master John Wood, enslaved 436 people. So this is a pretty large plantation for Delaware, the largest in this county, and enslaving a very large population. So the question, which maybe with further research it'll come out, how did these two find out about this opportunity? It's local. I mean, I think of where I live. I mean, you go down to the docks, there's always all sorts of rumors and talk of like good fishing grounds, or this boat just came in, anything like that. News of the day. The docks of the 18th century, early 19th century would be no different. And these two worked on a plantation that had a body of water butted up against it with rivers and tributaries running through the acreage. So I'm confident there was a network of communication that they at least heard about this or saw the arrival of this squadron. It's a pretty flat state, and if you're gonna, this is about 10 miles from where they live. So I'm confident they would have recognized this presence of a British squadron on their local waterway.
Obviously, you touched on their sort of skill set, right? They're navigating this
Sure.
water. Is this water sort of completely unknown to the British? Is it a real value? A real valuable skill to the British? And how were they then received from the rest of the crew?
Certainly. So yeah, the local waterways of the Delaware, even today, it's a choppy, shallow bay. They're very shoal laden. It's a lot of very narrow channels, and with the convergence of the Delaware Bay, River, and Atlantic coming together, the current the shoals are constantly shifting. So really, the last good chart of the Delaware that these fellows were using, I mean, the British Navy was using into the early 19th century, was done by Captain Andrew Snape Hammond of the Roebuck back in 1777. So that was sort of the most current chart of the Delaware. So they were desperately in need of local pilots. During the Revolution and during the War of 1812, British naval captains serving on the Delaware Bay were encouraged to procure local pilots. They had great luck with this during the Revolution. I mean, you saw every resident of Lewis and Pilottown really flock out and join these British vessels. During the War of 1812, it's not as clear, but these two would have been a massive asset for the crew. As far as how they were received, it varies. There's still an undertone of, I think, racism that exists. It's just sort of it exists across the board. I mean, there's the anti-Catholic sentiment as well that you see in a lot of memoirs of British sailors. There was a midshipman on the Poictiers, James Loftus, and he wrote a memoir in the 1830s about his service, and he really talks in depth about his time blockading Delaware on the North American station. And Edward Godfrey, he just refers to as the black fellow and the black. But he talks about how Godfrey proved himself to the crew. There was one instance where Poictiers came upon the Wasp and Frolic after their engagement in October of 1812, and they have this large contingent of American prisoners from the Wasp on board the Poictiers, And Godfrey overheard talk about cutting the black fellow's neck and how these American prisoners were going to rise up. And he came up on the deck, fired his gun, and protected his crew by sounding the alarm. And he earned a lot of respect from at least the junior officers through this act. King George, who piloted the ship down in Bermuda, they thought he was the most ridiculous thing in the world. His outfit and sort of his entire actions were not something that a largely European crew were used to. We can get into that later. I think there's other questions that might focus on that, but he was seen as completely ludicrous. That's the way he was described. But he was, again, really great at what he did, and the crew later recognized this. And I think more than anyone, so these two local fellows from Delaware, Jeremiah and Peter, they both immediately on joining the ship let the captain know where they could procure provisions. They were in desperate need of water. All their provisions were, months old from Bermuda. So they were able to navigate to the home of their former enslaver. They went to 5 barges, personally navigated these vessels up the nearby creek, and landed with 150 men and torched a lion's share of the property and took away a whole bunch of cattle, sheep, and just killed all of the livestock they couldn't take with them, then brought it back to the ship. So this was pretty substantial success for two guys that just rowed out on a rowboat to a ship, and then they immediately showed their shipmates where their allegiances lied and proved their value to the crew. So I think all of these, despite the initial sort of it's just a kind of racist undertone that existed amongst white sailors. I like to think there's an altruistic side of sailors in this period that once you demonstrate your skill set and ability, you're welcomed into the crew a bit more. And these fellows all were. Peter and Jeremiah later were rated able seamen and stayed with the ship following the War of 1812. So I think if that's not a testament, I'm not sure what would be.
We talk about this concept a lot on the show, particularly with reference to the army, and how once you prove yourself, the fact that you do prove yourself, it is what you can literally live and die by
Sure.
in a regiment. And it's no great surprise to hear of a similar concept
Certainly.
At sea. I've just been looking at a map to kind of get a better sense of the geography of it, and I'm curious what these guys no, there are 2 things that I want to ask. One is just the leap of faith really surprises me, that you've got a 74 gun ship of the line. This is it's not quite your aircraft carrier of the day, but nonetheless it is a very expensive, very important piece of kit that's being entrusted to these guys. And from, if I've understood what you said correctly, they are given the helm, and that's taking some risks and placing a lot of trust in these people, because it wouldn't take much, and these guys know where the shoals are, to just wreck the ship on a shoal, or ground it on a bank, or whatever it might be. But also I'm curious what the British operations actually look like in the Delaware, just kind of looking at the nature of the bay, because from what you're describing, it's not as though the British are just sort of sitting out at the mouth of the bay and just going, look, we'll just kind of seal this bit off and just sort of strangle trade out of Philadelphia. It sounds as though they're going much deeper upriver, but how deep are they going, and what are these British vessels doing if they do venture further upstream?
Sure. So immediately arriving on the Delaware Bay, they're desperate for provisions. There's a locally famous exchange between Beresford and the governor of Delaware. He makes a demand upon Lewis for cattle. He'll pay Philadelphia prices. He wants water, and they reply back like, we can't do that. It's contrary to the laws of war. So Beresford then, I'll be of the utmost necessity of destroying your town. Typical response. And there's a 24-hour bombardment that ensues. No one wins in this case, and then they look elsewhere. So they're constantly capturing vessels on the Delaware Bay. There's ships traffic still trying to sneak out from Philadelphia, and vessels returning up the Delaware that have absolutely no idea that war has been declared. Um, and then while they're here, there's two diaries of sailors, and they just write of how monotonous and boring it was. Blockade duty is, just like in Europe, it's boring, it gets old, there's no action. So they're doing smaller missions, going up some of these local waterways, smaller tributaries, going to local farms. They raided 5 different farms for cattle. They have local vessels they capture, and I mean loyalist again, masters who are navigating them up to different places. But they're puncturing up. I'd say up about 20 miles north on the Delaware, and that's really as high as you see them going. The shoals get a bit more intricate further up, so I don't know if it's the lack of pilots, but there's also the concern of just making sure that the entire Delaware River is blockaded and bottled up. They do not want anything going to and from. And this was and just anchoring on the Delaware. I mean, it was extremely successful. They crippled Philadelphia's entire economy. So it was very effective.
I just wanted to rabbit hole, Zach, so you'll be very pleased for this. I just wanted to go back. You talk about, obviously, this is a 74, right? This has got to have a complement of what, nigh on 600 hands?
Sure.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure the numbers exactly. Were the pilots the only people of color on board? I mean, I know the Navy at the time is famously sort of multinational.
Sure.
Is there any other representation there for people of color?
Yeah. So I unfortunately, a lot of these muster books are a bit colorblind unless they have a description book with them, which you'll see as you go into the 19th century a bit further. You'll have more details, but American seafarers, it's a heck of a lot easier to flesh out their backgrounds and ethnicity and race, thanks to seamen's protection certificates and things of that nature. So there's I've identified three other free black men, Americans that were serving on this vessel. One from Rhode Island, one from Baltimore, and one from Pennsylvania. So it's
Okay.
and these guys are all. I mean, I found protection certificates for them. This is another research project that is going to be a next year project, but trying to understand a bit more what brought them to serving on this British vessel. One of them is Cato Mumford. His father, it appears, served at the Battle of Trafalgar in the Royal Navy, and it goes they're as a free black man. His son was also born in Rhode Island, and now finds himself serving on a British vessel during the War of 1812. So it's some unusual background there that definitely requires further research. But there were other men of color on this vessel. She had a fairly large, I mean, English was the largest contingent. You had really big complement of Irishmen, the vast majority of them all impressed, as we often see. A fair bit of Portuguese sailors, some Spanish sailors, I think 5 Frenchmen. So it was as we expect, a fairly diverse crew.
Hmm. I mean, to be fair, I think that's probably another podcast episode right there, right, Zach?
Certainly.
Um, so you've got these black pilots, right? They're volunteered to serve the British. What is the white American reaction to these guys?
Um, so I suppose it's the most telling that I at least have evidence for would be with Peter and Jeremiah, the fellows on the Delaware Bay. So it was after a few days of rowing out and joining the British Navy. There's local newspapers that are reporting this of seen rowing to a 74, and you have these runaway slaves, and there's notices put out that one of the largest plantations lost 2 of their enslaved folks to the British Navy. There's a local magistrate in Lewis who kept a diary throughout the entire War of 1812 of the comings and goings of the Navy and whatnot. And he recorded in his diary that their master rode out to the Poictiers under a flag of truce, and Captain Beresford welcomed him aboard, and he demanded his property returned to him. And I think Beresford's response was something to the tune of like he didn't see property, but he was authorized to give them up if the boys were interested in returning home. And both of them were like, yeah, absolutely not. So Beresford showed him the door, and that was that. And this just blew the minds of these local Lewistowners. It's how dare they keep our property? But at this point, they have done a successful raid of their former master's plantation. They're fully indoctrinated into the crew. He's not going to give these guys up, and he also needs them. If you're going to continue to ensure the efficacy of this blockade, you need this local knowledge. And it just, I mean, I think he needed the crew members too. The muster book had, 431 men on its books at this point, with like 397 mustered. They were in desperate need of more sailors, and these two proved to be far more than that. So it's that's the only really case we have any evidence towards how they were received. Um, you have, I mean, with Edward Godfrey joining, all we have is just the sailors from the Wasp that were captured, just talking about the black fellow and how they wanted to cut the black man's neck and this and that. But Godfrey clearly was a pretty astute fellow and was watching things closely to be able to sound the alarm and crush this mini little prisoner rebellion.
I do love those little moments like that.
Certainly.
Where I mean, that's as close to a 19th century invitation to Foxtrot Oscar as
Yeah,
you were ever
exactly.
going to see. But done in just such a better style as well.
That's tremendous.
I'm curious about the trickle down of this. You're talking about how this appears in local news. It's appearing in papers.
Mm,
I think it would be a mistake to assume that an enslaved population is an illiterate population. I think that's one of the tropes that gets bandied around too much. That's not to
certainly.
say that everybody is, university educated amongst the enslaved population during this period,
Certainly.
but they're these individuals are sometimes tasked with things where you are going to be required to read and write. So the idea that that wouldn't then lead to a degree of literacy across an enslaved population, I think, is a trope that needs to be sort of bashed on the head. Um, so my gut would be that this news should spread amongst the enslaved population. An individual happens to read it in a discarded newspaper or whatever it might be, and then that gets shared around, and so on and so forth.
Mm,
So I'm curious about a US enslaved population response to this, but I'm also interested in whether or not the British enslaved population back in British colonies
mm.
ever hears about this, and what were the reactions of both those populations?
Sure. I mean, I wish I wish I knew, how this was received. I think we see greater evidence of the impact of these instances on the Chesapeake for certain. I mean, the droves of enslaved individuals, they're not just fleeing to the British because they're shooting the dice. I think Peter and Jeremiah took a pretty bold risk, but clearly they knew there's some sort of opportunity out here. And again, there's networks of communication on the waterfront, and especially amongst the enslaved populations of these places that are driving this maybe message of hope or opportunity. Um, I don't know sort of how the British population, how it was received there. Um, but we could look back, if we want to rewind way back, look like 1790s in Bermuda. You have James Jemmy Darrell. He was a local enslaved pilot who, he helped navigate for the first time out of St. George's Bay, which helped really make Bermuda a viable base for Britain's squadron in the Atlantic, thanks to the navigational prowess of this former enslaved man. And he was freed. He purchased his own home, and his exploits, his successes, went on to inspire other folks. It's really, seamanship became a emblem of black accomplishment in Bermuda. And you have other kings. He became known as the king's pilot, a royally appointed position. And you have other men of color who were regularly appointed as king's pilots. And King George was the name of one that we see on the Poictiers. And that would not have been possible were it not for Jemmy Darrell's accomplishments and the recognition there. So I think there were definitely, ramifications that spread throughout these populations. My God, certainly.
So, if we can, I want to look a little bit more into King George.
I,
I mean, it's a sort of it's an ear catching name off the bat. Is that his name? Is that a term of endearment? How is that viewed within His Majesty's Navy? Can you give us a bit more about his backstory?
certainly. He is he's probably the most colorful character kind of in this entire small chapter about these enslaved pilots. So King George and King Harry were the two king's pilots of Bermuda at this time, at least in St. George's. So James Loftus, again, this midshipman on the Poictiers, provides really, I mean, an entire chapter dedicated to King George. There's little trivial mentions of him in the vessel's logbook as well. But they come into Bermuda. Edward Godfrey successfully navigates the ship down the eastern seaboard, across the Atlantic to Bermuda, and then at this point, they really need the expertise of a local pilot. So they fire their gun, and the boat that rows out and boards them is manned by all black sailors, and then King George is this figure that ascends the quarter deck of the Poictiers, and he's described as wearing a suit of white with a collar halfway up his ears, and on his head a large straw hat. And this obviously a deliberate outfit. There's I mean, other historians who has encouraged this is a complete subversion of the societal norms, right? It's a kind of reverse minstrel show. He's deliberately taking this clothing that is very Western and very visible, and wearing it sort of to subvert this white authority. So pilots traditionally, I mean, I think I don't want to call them necessary evils, but they threw off the entire hierarchy. They undermine the hierarchy of shipboard authority, that you're, as a sailing master or as the captain of a vessel or quartermaster, anybody, you're admitting we're not comfortable doing our job here. We need to bring on this local authority, and you're turning the helm over to these people. So with a white pilot, I mean, we see these ramifications. Now let's take a very proud black pilot dressed in like the most lavish outfit, taking the helm. It's gonna completely throw off this crew. I have to pull up the exact line, but there's some mention of someone gives him a little bit of flack, and he completely throws it back. He's like, "I'm the pilot. You do your job. I watch the bottom. You watch the tops. Back off." And just completely snaps into this authoritative role, and it's incredible. I mean, and he navigates this beautifully. It's Beresford mentions it, Loftus mentions it. He brings the vessel right in, absolutely no problem. Hops off. I imagine him winking and like pointing at the captain and hopping back in his boat, rowing away. It's an incredible exchange. I mean, culturally and just sort of the role that he served and how necessary it was towards ensuring British success, whether they liked it or not.
I want to pick up on something that you've sort of alluded to already, which is impressment.
Mm,
We're familiar, well, I hope listeners are familiar with sort of the fabric of impressment. It is seen as a contributory factor to the War of 1812. What I'm curious about, though, is, I mean, it is fundamentally a form of
mm,
inscription. It's conscription. It's, you could make an argument that it's quasi-slavery, but that you'd need to sort of really
mm.
dig into sort of the fabric of how that works, to make that case. What I want to get at, though, is there any evidence of impressment of black men into the Royal Navy during this period, and why or why not?
Certainly. So yeah, I mean, I've seen it likened to slavery. I mean, you see the same. It's the rhetoric of the era. I mean, you see the Barbary Wars, a similar link. Um, I do think the one out with impressment. I'm not undermining how dreadful it was, but as a necessary evil. But I think there were more. it's not ever it's always black and white. I mean, I think there are you see really the guys that are listed as pressed men in the books. You have to be one stubborn bastard to be pressed onto a vessel. I mean, were I to be pressed, I would like I'll volunteer. I'll accept my advanced wages. I'll take a bounty. I mean, immediately that's an out, and that's much easier. And you might be rated as a ordinary seaman rather than a landsman at that point. Again, not negating its dreadful nature, but looking at black men pressed to serve, I have to believe so. I mean, it's if seamanship, you look at the crews of vessels in the American Merchant Marine, the vast majority that you see, I'll use Delaware again as my case study. This town was built on black sailors. You've free and enslaved black men that are crewing your merchant vessels. I'm hacking through. I just picked up an 1811 diary of a merchant vessel going to Russia, and I'm transcribing it at present. I found all the protection certificates for the entire crew, and 3/4 of the crew is black. And these guys are all rated able seamen. I mean, they have incredible careers. So they would be very attractive targets for the press gang. Again, I don't want to play up the colorblind trope, but clearly they're great seamen. They have skills. They can be rated an able seaman. They're top men. Yeah, they're the ideal target for the British Navy. Um, but I don't know if there would be more of a willingness to volunteer on these folks' behalf as they recognize the freedoms that would be afforded to them within the British Navy that they would not find in the American Merchant Marine or the U.S. Navy based on where we were on our kind of trajectory towards ending slavery. So it's really a mixed bag answer. I apologize.
Not at all. I think what folks are hearing there is, the realities of work at the cutting edge of our field, in
Mm,
that sometimes the answers aren't apparent, and fields such as this have opened up so much more in recent times that we are still searching for the answers rather than relying on sort of the shorthand
certainly.
assumptions that have plagued particularly race relations and um the study um of of black voices
Sure.
during this period. It's something that I feel quite acutely with my East India Company research. Lots of assumptions, but actually it's only within the last sort of 15, 20 years that really people have sort of properly started to question this. And we then have the big
Sure.
headache of source material. So I
I mean, and I think a big part of it as well is sort of flipping the narrative that, this is not a story of necessary. I mean, slavery is, of course, not a story of black suffering or these individuals being victims, but they're actively cognizant players and ensuring a better future for themselves. They're making really calculated decisions, weighing options, and recognizing what opportunity is going to propel them forward. So it's success stories. It's how they're overcoming the horrible obstacles that were placed in their lives to become the pilot of these vessels. Or, I mean, what comes next? I don't know. So
absolutely. One of the things that is particularly exciting at the moment is the way in which people are looking at people of all ethnicities and sections of society as active
mm,
participants
certainly,
wherever possible in their destinies,
certainly,
rather than just passive passengers, which is a phrase that I use quite a bit in
I like that.
what I'm writing at the moment. Um, I want to just kind of wrap this up by thinking
Sure.
about the legacies. Um, and I guess there are two avenues for this. One is sort of what is the longer term contribution of this story? Are there sort of echoes of this? Do we see it becoming a popular enough story that it gets repeated
Mm,
in the decades that follow? But also, what do
mm,
we know about the lives of these individuals once the war is over? Because you talk about how these guys are on the ship's books. How far
sure.
can we trace them?
King George and King Harry. I mean, I've not found anything beyond the War of 1812. They were king's pilots. They They were in Bermuda for the entire war, and I cannot find anything beyond that. Peter and Jeremiah, after their kind of foray into raiding their former masters' plantations, they stayed aboard the Poictiers. They sailed from the Delaware Bay. They left the Delaware in 1814, and they both were issued as or rated as able seamen at this point. So both ABs are getting paid just like everyone else. They were buying slop clothing at this point too. I mean, they're fully indoctrinated into the crew. I need to start digging into some muster books post 1815 to see what's next for them. But that's again another project I'd like to flesh out. It's could be a pretty remarkable story. Um, you'll see, I mentioned 1826. You have a congressional report that listed all of the slaves carried off by the British by state in violation of the Treaty of Ghent. And we're looking at, I think, it changes constantly. Current historians will argue it's about 5,000 enslaved people fled to the British and escaped slavery during the entire War of 1812. Out of that 5,000, only 2 claims are made for Delaware. And they were made by Thomas Primrose for Jeremiah Wood, and then one for Peter as well. That was the only 2 claims in the entire state of Delaware. But these guys definitely left Delaware. They never looked back. They were not discharged from the crew throughout the duration of the War of 1812. So more digging to do. Edward Godfrey, on the other hand, he fled American slavery, made his way up to Canada, reinvented himself as a pilot, navigated down to Bermuda, brought the vessel back up to the Delaware Bay. When they left the Delaware Bay in 1814, he ran from the ship in Bermuda. So the ship was taking on provisions, and him, along with was a Portuguese sailor and 2 Welsh sailors, were on leave and just didn't come back. Absolutely no idea what, we don't know where they went. They fled. They never rejoined the crew. I'd like to think he sought out a better opportunity in this maritime community of Bermuda, and I mean, full of opportunities there. He could have been on any vessel in any corner of the world, but I love that he was completely free of any link to America. I hope he never had to come back. I guess the other follow-up question was sort of the big picture beyond that. I mean, I often feel that like research like this is just very localized. It's a niche, but I think you take all of these and look at a much bigger picture. It had all of these stories together had pretty resounding consequences throughout the transatlantic. We talk about sort of that undertone of racism across the board. There is this assumption of Black inferiority, like it or not, that existed, in the turn of the century. But I think these men who boarded the ship, not just as pilots, but of pilots of color, they completely turned that upside down. It was contrary to everything that society was supposed to think about these folks. And then watching the naval successes that followed that were built upon their skill set, it's absolutely remarkable. So I hope that, these 4 pilots, they would help expand kind of the opportunities of what one could do in a similar capacity. And I just think I keep coming back to it. These guys knew exactly what they were doing. Every decision was very calculated, every risk weighed, and they ensured that they would pursue the greatest opportunity for their lives and what they wanted. So that's sort of my final thought there, I guess.
So on that note, thank you very much, Andrew. We'll call it a wrap there. For you guys listening, if you want to read more on Andrew's work, you can find it in the Sailors, Ships and Sea Fights. Go direct to Hellion. As Zach likes to say, we don't need to be lining Uncle Jeff's pockets, for rocket fuel. And we can also look forward to Andrew's forthcoming book, Going Among English Sailors, the American Tars aboard HMS Belvedere. I hope I've pronounced that properly. 1809 to 1814. And that'll be released in November 2024. Can you say the publisher for that, Andrew?
It's Pilot Sound Press is the name of the publisher.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we'll put all of that information in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. Take care and bye for now.
Hello again, folks. Please remember to whack that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on the huge amount of content we're producing as we push out episodes 3 times a week. And if you're loving the show, why not leave a 5-star review? It helps bump us back up the algorithm and reconnect with our lost audience following the Spotify meltdown. Did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and much more besides? To sign up, contact us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get your regular Napoleonic bulletin direct to your inbox. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you could spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbel, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically, easy for me to say, named Zed, which isn't just me boosting the numbers before anybody comes at me. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.